Yo, what's up, everyone? It's your boy Disaster. Welcome to a place where there's no turning back. This is a marathon designed to put you under. Whether it's scorching summer or a rainy spring outside, forget about it. In here, the rain never stops, and the year is nothing but a bone-chilling, frozen winter. The sky out there? It's never gonna clear up. Here's the deal, and I need you to follow my lead. Get to your room, kill the lights, and throw on your headphones. Lay back, get comfortable, and hit that auto replay setting. Close both eyes, and listen till the very end. I'm telling you, the dread levels are gonna spike with every passing minute. And look, before we dive into the abyss, if you feel like this hour of horror is worth it, smash that like button. It doesn't cost you a dime, but it means the world to me. I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into crafting this hour-long nightmare just for you. Brace yourself, boss, it's time for some ice-cold horror. Enjoy the ride. A man collapsed straight through the front door of 221B, Baker Street at 4 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Bang! The heavy oak door flew back against the wall, and Dr. Thornycroft Huxtable, the headmaster of the famous Priory School in Yorkshire, staggered into our sitting room like a walking corpse. His expensive wool coat was torn to shreds, his trousers were caked in wet yellow mud, and blood was trickling down from his cracked lower lip. He didn't even make it 3 steps across the carpet. His knees buckled, his eyes rolled back into his skull, and he hit the floorboards face first with a heavy, sickening thud. I dropped my newspaper, sprang up from my chair, and sprinted across the room to his side. "Holmes, help me!" I yelled, turning the heavy man onto his back. He's in severe shock. His pulse is wildly irregular, and his skin is ice cold. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my brandy flask, unscrewed the brass cap, and forced 3 heavy gulps of neat alcohol straight down his throat. Sherlock Holmes didn't even bother getting up from his leather armchair in the corner. He sat there in his dressing gown, surrounded by a dense cloud of stale blue tobacco smoke, watching the dying man on our carpet with cold, unblinking gray eyes. His expression was as hard and blank as a slab of granite. He didn't show a single drop of human pity. "Save your breath, Watson," Holmes said, his voice flat, sharp, and razor-thin. "The man isn't dying of physical exhaustion. He's dying of sheer terror. Speak, Dr. Huxtable. You didn't ride 3 hours on an express train from Yorkshire just to bleed out on my Persian rug." Huxtable choked violently on the alcohol, coughing up blood and spirits onto his lapels. His wild, bloodshot eyes darted frantically around the room until his mud-stained fingers locked onto the cuff of my trousers like an iron clamp. "Lord Saltire!" Huxtable gasped, his lungs wheezing violently as he fought for every breath. "He's gone, Dr. Watson. Stolen. Taken straight out of his room in the dead of night." I felt a cold shock hit my chest. Lord Saltire. The 10-year-old son of the Duke of Holderness. The sole heir to the entire Holderness fortune. Huxtable screamed, his voice cracking into a desperate, high-pitched sob that echoed off our walls. The boy was pulled from his bed on Monday night. The Duke is out of his mind with rage. He's offering a £5,000 reward on the spot to anyone who brings his boy back alive. I looked up at Holmes. A £5,000 reward was an astronomical sum, enough to buy a mansion in London, but Holmes didn't even blink. He took another slow, calm pull from his pipe and exhaled a long ring of smoke toward the ceiling. "Tell me about the locks," Holmes commanded, his tone completely devoid of emotion. "How did the kidnappers break through the school security?" That's the horror of it, Mr. Holmes. Huxtable cried out, wringing his hands together frantically. There were no broken locks. No shattered glass. No iron bars forced open. The boy's bedroom door was locked securely from the inside. The boy simply vanished into thin air overnight. I leaned forward, incredulous. A 10-year-old boy doesn't just evaporate through solid stone walls, Huxtable. Did anyone search the grounds? We searched every inch of the school. Huxtable rasped. And that's when we found the second nightmare. When we checked the back wing, the German master, Herr Heidegger, was missing too. His bedroom window was thrown wide open. The thick ivy vines clinging to the outer wall were torn away. And his bicycle is completely missing from the tool shed. I stood up, my hand instinctively dropping to my hip. The German teacher abducted the boy. We don't know. Huxtable yelled, tears cutting clean tracks through the thick grime on his pale cheeks. The entire moor outside the school is covered in a dense, freezing fog. The local police are completely blind, wandering in circles through the bogs. You have to come, Mr. Holmes. A child is out there in the dark, and the whole countryside smells like death. Holmes stood up in one swift, silent, predatory motion. He knocked the ash from his pipe, tossed it onto the mantelpiece, and reached for his heavy wool overcoat hanging on the wall peg. He turned his cold gray gaze onto me, his face tight and severe. Load your Webley revolver, Watson, Holmes commanded, his voice cold, flat, and absolute. 6 heavy lead rounds. We take the 5 o'clock train to Yorkshire. A duke's son is in the dark, a teacher is on the run, and somebody in that school is lying through their teeth. The express train from King's Cross rocketed north through the pitch-black Yorkshire night, its iron wheels hammering against the steel rails with a deafening, rhythmic roar. Inside our private compartment, the air was thick with the bitter smell of cheap pipe tobacco and cold cinder dust. I sat by the window, cleaning my Webley revolver under the dim, flickering glow of the overhead oil lamp, while Holmes sat across from me in total silence. He hadn't touched his tea or spoken a single word since we left London 3 hours ago. His eyes were closed, his sharp chin buried deep inside the high wool collar of his coat, but his mind was running at the speed of a runaway locomotive. At midnight, the train screeched to a halt at the isolated, freezing platform of Machagger Station. Dr. Huxtable was waiting for us on the damp wooden boards, shivering violently in the howling moorland wind alongside a high-wheeled dog-cart driven by a local stableman. Without wasting a second on pleasantries, Holmes and I hauled ourselves up into the back seat, and the horse bolted forward into the swirling gray fog. 40 minutes later, the iron gates of the Priory School loomed ahead like the jagged battlements of a medieval prison. It was a sprawling, ancient Gothic structure built from dark, frost-bitten stone, isolated on the edge of the vast, treacherous Dunal Moor. Not a single light burned in the upper windows, the whole school looked dead, wrapped in a thick, suffocating shroud of silence. The heavy front oak door swung open as we approached, and a tall, imposing figure stepped out into the porch to greet us. It was the Duke of Holderness. Even in the freezing dark, his presence was overwhelming. He stood over 6 feet tall, dressed in a heavy black riding cloak, with a sharp, aristocratic jawline, cold blue eyes, and a striking red beard streaked with gray. But behind his calm, icy facade, you could see the raw, jagged edges of panic. His hands were clenched so tight into fists that his knuckles were stark white. Beside him stood his personal secretary, James Wilder, a slender, nervous young man with sharp, darting eyes who kept shifting his weight from foot to foot like a caged animal. "Mr. Holmes," the Duke said, his voice deep, smooth, and chillingly controlled. I am deeply grateful you came. Find my son. Spare no expense, use any method, but bring Lord Salter back to me alive. Holmes didn't step down from the cart immediately. He sat there in the shadows, his eyes boring straight through the Duke's proud posture right down to the man's terrified soul. I do not work for your title, your grace, nor do I work for your gold, Holmes said, his voice cutting through the freezing night wind like a scalpel. I work for the truth. And right now, your household is leaking lies from every seam. James Wilder flinched as if he'd been physically struck, stepping forward with an angry flush on his pale cheeks. How dare you speak to the Duke like that? His son has been stolen by a traitorous employee, and you stand here. Quiet, James, the Duke commanded sharply, raising a gloved hand to silence his secretary. He looked back at Holmes with a steady, unblinking gaze. Mr. Holmes, do whatever you must. Inspect the rooms, question the staff, tear the school apart. Just find my boy. Holmes finally stepped down from the cart, his heavy boots crunching hard against the gravel path. Lead the way, Dr. Huxtable, Holmes snapped, pulling his cap down tight against the rising wind. Show me the boy's bedroom. Let us see what secrets these stone walls are trying so desperately to hide. We climbed the grand stone staircase to the second-floor dormitory wing, our boots echoing heavily against the bare oak floorboards. Dr. Huxtable unlocked a heavy mahogany door at the end of the corridor and pushed it open, holding a flickering brass oil lamp high to illuminate the room. It was Lord Salter's bedroom. Everything inside was impeccably neat and orderly. The oak wardrobe doors were shut tight, the study desk was cleared of clutter, and the single bed was unmade, with the heavy woolen blankets tossed back as if the boy had just rolled out of them in a hurry. Holmes didn't say a word. He handed his overcoat to me, dropped straight down onto his hands and knees on the carpet, and pulled his pocket magnifying glass from his vest pocket. Look at the latch on the window, Watson, Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. I leaned over the sill. The window was a heavy, double-casement sash, fitted with iron latches. It was currently pushed wide open, letting the freezing Yorkshire gale sweep into the room. It was unlocked from the inside, I observed. He must have opened it himself. Or someone told him to open it, Holmes replied, his lens hovering mere inches above the wooden frame. Look at the dark scratches along the paint. Someone used a thin metal blade to slip the latch from the outside without breaking the glass. A clean, professional job. Not the work of a 10-year-old child waking up from a bad dream. Holmes stood up in one fluid movement and leaned his upper body completely out of the open window into the dark night air. The ivy, Holmes muttered, squinting down into the black abyss below. I leaned out beside him. Clinging to the gray stone wall of the school was a thick, ancient network of green ivy vines, stretching all the way down to the gravel courtyard 3 stories below. But right beneath Lord Salter's window, the thick stems were violently ripped away from the masonry, leaving raw, wet patches of stone exposed to the weather. He climbed down. I asked, frowning. He didn't climb down by choice, Holmes corrected coldly, pulling himself back inside and dusting his knees. He was hauled down, or forced at knife point to descend while someone held his weight. Let us go down to the courtyard. The ground below holds the real story. We hurried back down the stairs and stepped out into the dark, rain-soaked quadrangle behind the school wing. Huxtable held the oil lamp low as Holmes swept the beam of his own pocket lantern across the soft, muddy flower beds right beneath the bedroom window. Suddenly, Holmes froze. He dropped to one knee, planting his face inches from the wet earth. Watson, Holmes said, and for the first time that night, a strange, electric edge of excitement sharpened his voice. "Come look at this." I crouched beside him, holding the lamp steady. Pressed deep into the soft, clay-heavy soil were distinct footprints. But they weren't human shoes. They weren't bicycle tires either. The impressions were wide, heavy, and square-shaped, featuring a cloven split right down the middle. "What in God's name?" I muttered, staring at the strange tracks in disbelief. "Are those cow hooves?" Holmes stood up slowly, dusting his hands, his gray eyes shining like polished steel in the dark. "Cows walking across a school courtyard at 2 in the morning, Watson," Holmes whispered, a dark, dangerous smile touching his lips. "Except these tracks are entirely artificial. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to disguise their steps. The game has officially begun." The first pale, sickly rays of dawn cut through the heavy gray fog hanging over Dunal Moor. It was a desolate, terrifying wasteland, miles of spongy, black peat bogs, jagged rock formations, and treacherous mud flats stretching as far as the eye could see, broken only by narrow, winding sheep tracks. Holmes and I stood 50 yards behind the school wall, tracing the path where the mysterious tracks led away from the courtyard. "Here is where the German teacher entered the narrative," Holmes said, pointing his walking stick down at a broken ivy branch near the back gate. Her Heidegger was a light sleeper. He must have looked out his window, saw the boy being forced across the yard, and realized immediately what was happening. I scanned the muddy earth. Faintly visible alongside the bizarre cloven hoof prints was a thin, straight line carved into the wet turf, the narrow rubber tire track of a bicycle. He didn't sound the alarm, I noted, watching the tracks head straight out toward the open, fog-choked moor. He grabbed his bicycle and rode out into the dark alone to save the boy. "A brave, foolish mistake," Holmes murmured, his eyes scanning the bleak horizon like a hunting hound tracking a wounded wolf. He thought he could intercept them before they reached the deep bogs. But out here in the dark, courage without a plan is just a fast ticket to a shallow grave. We walked faster, our boots sinking ankle-deep into the cold, rotting peat. The trail wound its way deeper and deeper into the wilderness, away from any roads, houses, or civilization. Why would anyone go to the absurd length of carving wooden cow shoes? I asked, panting slightly as I struggled to keep pace with Holmes's relentless stride. "It's an insane disguise. Because a man walking across a moor leaves human footprints that the police can track, measure, and match to boots," Holmes replied without slowing down. "But cow tracks. Cows wander everywhere out here. To a casual observer, livestock prints blend right into the landscape. It was designed to trick local shepherds and police inspectors, but whoever planned this forgot that an observant eye looks at depth and stride, not just the shape." Suddenly, Holmes slammed his hand against my chest, stopping me dead in my tracks. He held up a single finger, signaling absolute silence. I strained my ears against the howling moorland wind. Through the whistling gale, a faint, metallic glint caught my eye from behind a cluster of black, jagged rocks 50 yards ahead. It was the twisted frame of a bicycle wheel, sticking up out of the black mud like a broken skeleton. Holmes drew his walking stick back, his face tightening into a cold, lethal mask. "Keep your hand on your Webley, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp register. "We have reached the end of the trail." We broke into a fast, silent sprint across the spongy turf, our boots splashing violently through the black puddles until we reached the cluster of jagged rocks. The sight waiting for us behind the ridge was pure, unadulterated horror. Lying tossed on its side in the deep peat was her Heidegger's bicycle, its front wheel bent completely double into a jagged metal oval. And right beside it, Face down in a thick pool of dark, congealed blood, lay the German teacher. I dropped to my knees, grabbed him by the shoulders, and rolled him over onto his back. I instantly let go, recoiling back in shock. His face was a grotesque, unrecognizable mask of crushed bone and dried crimson. The back of his skull had been completely shattered by a massive, brutal blow from a heavy blunt instrument, likely an iron bar or a thick wooden club wielded with murderous, overwhelming force. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly up at the gray, weeping sky with a look of eternal terror. "He's dead, Holmes," I whispered, my voice shaking as I checked his ice-cold wrist. "There's no pulse. He died hours ago." Holmes didn't flinch. He dropped down beside the corpse, totally unfazed by the carnage, and pulled his magnifying glass from his coat. He leaned over the dead man's hands, carefully examining his torn, blood-caked fingernails. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said, his voice flat, cold, and utterly devoid of pity. "He didn't go down without a fight. His nails are full of dark wool fibers and dried mud. He caught up to them right here, grabbed the reins or the kidnapper's coat, and tried desperately to pull the boy back." Holmes stood up slowly, dusting off his knees, his gray eyes burning with a dark, dangerous fire. "The kidnapper didn't want witnesses," Holmes continued, scanning the empty, mist-shrouded horizon. "The German teacher thought he was rescuing a helpless child. Instead, he walked straight into an ambush and got his skull crushed like an eggshell." I stood up, unbuttoning my holster and letting my hand rest firmly on the grip of my loaded Webley. "The boy saw this, Holmes. Lord Salter was right here when they murdered his teacher." "Yes," Holmes murmured, a grim, hard line tightening across his jaw. "A 10-year-old child watched a man die in the mud for trying to save him. The monsters who planned this aren't just kidnapping for ransom, Watson. They are playing a very bloody, very lethal game, and we are going to end it tonight." We left the dead German teacher guarded by a local police constable who had finally caught up to our position, and pressed forward along the trail of the cloven hoof prints. The artificial cow tracks wound away from the murder scene, cutting across the bleak, empty expanse of the moor until they led straight to a miserable, run-down stone building sitting near the main coach road, the Fighting Cock Inn. It was a grim, isolated tavern with shuttered windows, a rotting wooden roof, and a thin stream of black smoke wheezing out of its stone chimney. "Stay close, Watson," Holmes instructed quietly, his fingers resting on his heavy walking stick. "The landlord of this tavern is about to learn that murder leaves a very distinct scent." Holmes didn't bother knocking. He slammed his palm against the heavy oak door, throwing it wide open, and stepped straight into the dim, smoke-filled taproom. The air inside smelled thick of stale beer, wet dog, and cheap tobacco. Sitting behind the wooden bar was a thick-necked, brutal-looking man with a broken nose, dark stubble, and cold, suspicious eyes. He was cleaning a greasy glass with a filthy rag. "Reuben Hayes." "We're closed," Hayes grunted, not even looking up as he slammed the glass onto the counter. "Get out of my tavern." Holmes walked straight up to the bar, ignoring the warning completely. He leaned his weight forward onto his knuckles, locking his piercing gray eyes onto the landlord's face. "We need horses, Mr. Hayes," Holmes said, his voice smooth and razor-sharp. "2 fast mounts, immediately." Hayes sneered, flashing a row of yellow teeth. "I don't rent horses to city gentlemen. Go back to your school." "Strange," Holmes snapped, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "Because I saw fresh horse manure in your barn out back. And more importantly, I saw those clever wooden shoes you carved to make horse hooves look like cattle tracks in the mud." Hayes froze. The greasy rag dropped from his hand. His face turned pale, then instantly darkened with a violent, murderous rage. Without a word, he dove his hand underneath the wooden counter, his fingers scraping frantically against the dark wood as he reached for a concealed weapon. "Look out!" I roared. I whipped my Webley revolver out of my holster, thumbed back the hammer with a sharp click, and leveled the black barrel straight between the landlord's eyes. "Don't even twitch, you bastard," I warned, my finger tight on the trigger, the cold metal trembling slightly with adrenaline as the heavy silence of the tavern stretched to a breaking point. Hayes slowly pulled his empty hand back from beneath the counter, his knuckles white with suppressed fury, realizing the sheer impossibility of drawing his own pistol before my lead slug shattered his skull. "A wise choice of hesitation, Mr. Hayes," Holmes remarked coldly, stepping past me with absolute nonchalance. He leaned over the counter, his sharp gaze sweeping the dark corners of the room before locking back onto the trembling tavern keeper. "Where is the boy? And where is the carriage that carried him away into the midnight fog?" "I don't know what you're babbling about, you mad bastard." Hayes spat, his voice shaking with venomous defiance. "There's no boy here. This is a public house, and you're trespassing on private property without a warrant." "A warrant can be signed by a magistrate in 5 minutes, Holmes replied smoothly, pulling a silver pocket watch from his vest and flipping the lid open with a crisp click. "Unfortunately for you, neither the local constabulary nor the Duke of Holderness's personal guards have 5 minutes to waste on your legal technicalities. Speak now, Hayes, or let my companion introduce your stubborn skull to the business end of his service pistol." The heavy oak door behind us suddenly rattled violently as the wind howled against the iron hinges, whistling through the cracks in the stone walls like a pack of hunting wolves. Outside, the endless expanse of the Yorkshire moor stretched out into the black abyss, hiding its secrets beneath layers of deadly mist. Hayes stared at me, then looked at the cold, calculating eyes of Sherlock Holmes, calculating his slim chances of survival in a room that smelled of stale ale and impending doom. Reuben Hayes froze instantly, his hand trapped halfway beneath the counter, staring straight down the heavy .455 barrel of my Webley revolver. "Search the barn, Watson," Holmes ordered, his voice remaining terrifyingly calm as he kept his eyes locked on the bartender. "Find what he is hiding." I backed away slowly toward the rear exit, keeping my gun leveled at Hayes's chest until I cleared the doorway, then sprinted across the muddy yard toward the stone stable. The heavy oak stable door was unlocked. I shoved it open and stepped into the dim, straw-strewn interior. 2 heavy draft horses stood in the stalls, breathing hard, their coats caked in dried gray mud and sweat, reeking of a frantic, forced gallop through the midnight mist. I walked up to the first horse and lifted its front hoof. My breath caught in my throat. Fastened securely over the standard iron horseshoe with heavy leather straps was a custom-carved wooden block shaped into a cloven cow's hoof. The mud caked inside the split wood was still wet and fresh. Suddenly, a violent crash echoed from the front of the inn, the sharp sound of shattering glass and splintered wood. I spun around, bolted out of the stable, and sprinted back into the taproom, my boots sliding through the mud. The room was wrecked. A heavy oak table had been smashed into pieces, overturned right in front of the bar. Holmes was dodging a wild, swinging blow from a heavy iron fire poker, and Reuben Hayes was already flying through the shattered back window into the yard, scrambling desperately toward the open moor on foot. Holmes didn't bother chasing him into the fog. He stepped over the broken glass, his eyes locked on a heavy wooden door at the top of the interior stairs. "Never mind the landlord, Watson," Holmes said, his voice burning with intense triumph. "The boy is upstairs." We charged up the narrow wooden steps, the old stairs groaning heavily beneath our boots as we reached the upper landing. Holmes did not hesitate, He drew back his leg and kicked the locked chamber door squarely in the center, splintering the frame and sending the panels crashing inward. The small, bleak room was bitterly cold. In the corner, huddled on a narrow iron cot covered in filthy wool blankets, was a small figure shivering violently. I stepped inside, lowering my revolver as the boy looked up, blinking wide, terrified blue eyes against the sudden rush of cold air and candlelight. He was pale, exhausted, and desperately frail, but he was completely unharmed. "Lord Saltire." "It is quite all right, my boy," Holmes said softly, stepping forward and kneeling beside the bed to wrap his own coat around the trembling child's shoulders. "Your father is waiting for you back at the school. The nightmare is finally over." We kicked the locked wooden door off its iron hinges with a single, brutal shove. Crash! The door flew inward, slamming against the whitewashed wall of a small, dusty upstairs bedroom. Sitting in a straight-backed wooden chair in the far corner of the room was Lord Saltire. He looked terrified, pale, and exhausted, his expensive private school uniform stained with grease and mud, but he was completely unharmed. When the bright light hit his face, he let out a choked, panicked sob and buried his face in his trembling hands. "Are you hurt, young man?" I asked immediately, rushing across the room, shedding my heavy overcoat, and wrapping it around his shaking shoulders. "No, sir." The boy whimpered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Just cold. And I heard screaming outside earlier." I looked through the window gap. I saw her Heidegger fall down in the mud, there was so much blood. Holmes stepped into the room, his eyes scanning every inch of the space with cold, surgical precision. He walked over to a small bedside table. Resting on the scarred wood was a plate of half-eaten cold meat, a glass of water, and a crumpled piece of white paper. Holmes picked up the paper. It was a handwritten note, penned in an elegant, refined script. He read it in 2 seconds, and a dark, dangerous smile crossed his thin lips. "You were lured out of your dormitory by someone you trusted implicitly, weren't you, my boy?" Holmes asked gently, kneeling down beside the child. Lord Saltire lowered his hands, looked up at Holmes with wide, tear-filled eyes, and nodded slowly, a single tear cutting a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "It's all right," Holmes said softly, rising to his feet, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the barren floorboards. "You are safe now. The nightmare is over." He folded the note carefully, slipped it securely inside his breast pocket, and turned to face me. "Watson, escort Lord Saltire back to the village police station immediately," Holmes commanded, his tone absolute. "Ensure 3 armed officers guard his door night and day until I return to London." I frowned, gripping the checkered grip of my Webley. "Where are you going, Holmes? You can't possibly intend to face the masterminds of this kidnapping alone in the dead of night." Holmes pulled his wool hat down tight against his brow, his gray eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light that brooked no argument. "To Holderness Hall," Holmes replied, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp register. "It is time to collect our £5,000, and corner the master predator who wrote this letter." Without waiting for my reply, he turned on his heel and strode down the narrow corridor, leaving me alone with the shivering boy as the distant howl of the Yorkshire wind mocked us from the darkness outside. The massive iron gates of Holderness Hall loomed through the freezing mist like the jagged teeth of a sleeping iron beast as our carriage ground to a halt on the grand gravel driveway. The estate was a sprawling monument to ancient wealth and unyielding aristocratic power, built from dark, frost-bitten stone that seemed to absorb every ounce of light from the grey Yorkshire sky. But tonight, beneath its towering Gothic spires and shadowed archways, the grand mansion felt less like a home and more like a heavily guarded tomb waiting to be unlocked. I slammed the carriage door shut behind me, my hand resting firmly on the grip of my loaded Webley revolver inside my coat pocket, while Holmes strode up the wide stone steps with the relentless, unyielding pace of an executioner marching to the gallows. We didn't wait for the butler to announce us. Holmes seized the heavy brass door knocker and brought it down twice against the oak panels with a sharp, echoing thud that rattled the stained glass windows above. A terrified, pale-faced footman cracked the door open a few inches, stammering an immediate protest. "His Grace is not receiving visitors tonight." Holmes didn't waste a single breath on pleasantries. He planted the palm of his hand flat against the heavy door, shoved it wide open with brutal force, and marched straight into the grand marble foyer, his heavy boots clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. "Tell the Duke that Sherlock Holmes has returned from the moor," Holmes announced, his voice slicing through the silent, vaulted hallway like a cold butcher's knife. "And we are finished playing hide and seek." We didn't wait for permission. Holmes turned sharply down the familiar corridor leading to the Duke's private library, his long dark coat billowing behind him like the wings of a shadow. He didn't even knock, he threw the double mahogany doors wide open and stepped straight into the candlelit sanctuary of the master's study. The Duke of Holderness was standing by the massive stone fireplace, holding a crystal glass of amber port in his trembling hand. But he wasn't alone. Standing right beside the mahogany desk, frantically gathering a thick stack of legal documents and railway timetables into a leather traveling case, was James Wilder. The secretary's face was slick with cold sweat, his eyes darting frantically toward the door as we blocked his only exit. When Wilder saw Holmes standing in the doorway, his hands froze over the papers, and all the color drained instantly from his face until he looked like a corpse. The Duke slowly set his glass down on the stone mantelpiece. His aristocratic composure was visibly cracking, the cold, untouchable mask he wore in public had dissolved into a mask of raw, exhausted dread. Mr. Holmes," the Duke stammered, his deep voice losing its usual iron control. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? And where is my son?" Holmes walked slowly into the center of the library, his piercing gray eyes locked like steel talons onto the Duke's face, completely ignoring the panicking secretary. "Your son is safe, Your Grace," Holmes said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that chilled the air in the room. "He is currently resting under heavy armed guard at the village police station. But I am afraid I cannot say the same for your domestic arrangements." Holmes stopped dead in his tracks, turned his head slowly, and glared directly at James Wilder. "You planned to slip away on the midnight coach to Liverpool, didn't you, Mr. Wilder?" Holmes asked, a dark, mocking smile touching his thin lips. "A sudden, urgent business trip to Australia, booked in the dead of night. How remarkably convenient for a man who just lost his favorite accomplice to the gallows." James Wilder let out a high-pitched, hysterical gasp, backing away until his spine slammed hard against the heavy bookshelves. "You're insane. The Duke will have you thrown off these grounds before you can." "Quiet, James," the Duke thundered, raising a trembling hand to silence his secretary. He turned to Holmes, his chest heaving as he braced himself for the blow. "You found my son. You solved the crime. Name your price, Mr. Holmes. Name any sum you desire, take the £5,000 reward, and leave this house tonight." Holmes didn't flinch. He reached slowly into his breast pocket, pulled out the crumpled white note we found on the bedside table at the Fighting Cock Inn, and tossed it contemptuously onto the Duke's mahogany desk. "I don't want your blood money, Your Grace," Holmes said, his voice turning as hard and cold as iron. "I want the truth. Because the man standing right beside you didn't just kidnap a 10-year-old boy, He murdered a man in cold blood to cover his tracks. And you, Duke, you knew about it all along." The silence over the Duke's private library was heavy and absolute. Not a clock ticked. Even the crackling fire in the stone hearth seemed to quiet down, choked by the sudden tension. James Wilder collapsed against the mahogany bookshelf, his knees giving out. He slid down the polished wood to the Persian rug, clutching his head and sobbing in ragged, hysterical gasps. The arrogant secretary was gone, stripped bare by exposure. The Duke of Holderness didn't move. He stood frozen by the mantelpiece, his tall frame looking older, his broad shoulders weighed down by an invisible mountain of guilt. He stared down at the crumpled white note on his desk, the trap that had lured his young son into the dark, as if the ink were written in acid. "It's a masterpiece of family betrayal, isn't it?" Holmes said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He stepped closer to the desk, his eyes boring into the Duke's soul. "You thought you could buy your way out of the abyss, Your Grace. You thought a £5,000 reward would keep the police looking blindly across the bogs while your eldest son slipped quietly away to the other side of the world." The Duke slowly raised his head. His cold blue eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with deep circles of utter exhaustion. "You know everything, Mr. Holmes," the Duke whispered, his deep voice cracking into a dry rasp. "You have uncovered every dark secret I tried to bury. I know that James Wilder is not merely your secretary," Holmes replied coldly, leaning forward with his hands planted flat on the desk. "He is your eldest son. Born of a first marriage long before you inherited this title, a marriage kept hidden because society demanded a more suitable match." James Wilder let out a loud, broken wail from the floor, burying his face deeper into his arms. "He grew up in this house," Holmes continued relentlessly, watching his younger half-brother inherit every acre of land, every title, and every ounce of privilege that rightfully belonged to him as the firstborn. "He grew bitter, desperate, and last month, he hatched a vicious plot to break you. I only wanted what was mine." Wilder screamed from the floor, his voice pitched high with frantic rage. "I wanted my share. I wanted my name recognized. He was going to leave me with nothing." "Quiet, James," the Duke commanded, though his voice sounded hollow, broken by his compounding sins. The Duke turned his gaze slowly back to Holmes, letting out a long, heavy sigh. "It is true," the Duke murmured, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "When I discovered what James had done, when I found out he had manipulated my younger boy out of his room and hidden him at the Fighting Cock Inn, I was torn in two. My blood rebelled against handing my own flesh and blood over to the gallows. I went to the inn in secret. I saw my boy safe. But instead of returning him immediately, I made a cowardly mistake." "You made a deal with a murderer," Holmes snapped, his voice dropping into a quiet register. "You allowed Reuben Hayes to keep the boy hidden for another 24 hours while you arranged fake travel papers and secret money for James to escape to Australia. You protected your family's precious name, while an innocent German teacher lay dead in the black mud of the moor with his skull crushed." The Duke flinched violently as if struck. He bowed his head, unable to meet Holmes's gaze. "I am a magistrate, a peer of the realm, and a leader of men," the Duke whispered, trembling with self-loathing. "And yet, when the hour of true moral test arrived, I acted like a coward. I chose the honor of my house over the life of an innocent man. I stood near the double doors, my hand resting firmly on the grip of my Webley revolver, watching the tragic collapse of one of the most powerful men in England. It was a dark, sickening display of how corruption and pride rot a household from within." Holmes stepped back, straightening his coat, his face as cold as stone. "The law has a very specific debt to collect tonight, Your Grace," Holmes said quietly. Reuben Hayes is in custody, and he will swing from a rope for the murder of her Heidegger. As for James Wilder. Holmes turned his gray eyes down toward the sobbing secretary. He will pack a single bag tonight, Holmes commanded, leaving zero room for negotiation. He will board the first morning train to Liverpool, and he will sail for Australia on the next tide. If he ever sets foot on British soil again, my report goes straight to Scotland Yard, and no amount of gold will save him from the executioner. The Duke didn't argue. He slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a thick checkbook, and pushed it across the desk toward Holmes along with a signed document of compliance. "It shall be as you say, Mr. Holmes," the Duke said softly, his voice barely audible above the burning logs. "The ghosts of this house have finally come home to collect." The early morning sun rose over the Yorkshire moors, painting the jagged, black rocks in a pale, sickly light. It was cold, the kind of biting, damp cold that seeps straight into your marrow, but for the first time in 3 days, the oppressive shroud of fog had lifted, revealing the vast, silent stretch of the bogs for what they were, a graveyard for the forgotten. The train ride back to London was long, quiet, and heavy. Holmes sat in the corner of our compartment, his face turned toward the window, watching the desolate landscape blur by. He didn't speak. He didn't fiddle with his pipe, nor did he hum one of his restless violin melodies. He just watched the world move, his sharp, predatory eyes reflecting the bleak emptiness of the countryside he had just torn apart. I sat across from him, staring at the £5,000 check resting on the small table between us, a fortune that could have changed our lives overnight, but somehow, in the wake of the blood and betrayal we had just witnessed, it felt like nothing more than a piece of worthless paper. "The Duke will get his silence," I said, breaking the silence as the train began its slow crawl into the industrial outskirts of London. "Wilder is halfway to the docks by now, and Hayes is waiting for the gallows. The name of Holderness will stay clean in the morning papers." Holmes turned his head slowly away from the window. His expression was as hard and unreadable as ever, but there was a strange, grim finality in his tone. "The name remains clean, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low and vibrating with a dark, cynical edge. "But the rot inside that house hasn't been cured, it has only been cauterized. Secrets buried in the moor don't stay buried forever. They have a way of surfacing when the rain washes the mud away." We reached Baker Street in the late afternoon. The familiar, comforting hum of London traffic and the smell of roasting coal greeted us as we stepped out of our cab. It felt strange to be back, to see people laughing, walking their dogs, and hurrying to dinner, completely unaware of the brutal, twisted game that had been played out in the shadows of the Yorkshire bogs. Inside 221B, the rooms were exactly as we had left them. My journal sat open on my desk, the ink dry and the pen resting where I had dropped it 3 days ago. Holmes walked over to his fireplace, kicked the dormant coals into a spark, and watched as the warmth finally began to bleed back into the room. He walked over to his violin case, opened it with a slow, deliberate motion, and lifted the instrument. He didn't sit down. He simply stood in the center of the room, looking at the dark, empty corner where the shadows always seemed to gather thickest. "Write it all down, Watson," Holmes said, his voice dropping into that familiar, razor-sharp register that marked the end of a hunt. "Every detail. The fake hooves, the cold blood in the mud, the Duke's cowardice, and the secretary's ruin. Record the darkness exactly as we saw it, even if the public is fed a polished lie by the local press." "Why, Holmes?" I asked, picking up my pen. "If the case is closed and the secret is sealed, why preserve the rot?" Holmes raised his bow, held it poised over the strings for a brief, electric second, and then drew it across with a single, haunting, mournful note that echoed like a human cry through the apartment. Because the dark corners are always there, Watson, Holmes whispered, not looking at me. And someone must keep the record of the light, no matter how brief it burns. The Priory School is finished. The ghosts are laid to rest. Put it away. Good morning, good evening to you, boss. This has been Disaster on the Radio.